And I should start with the confession that for me personally, demography is things that interest me incredibly. And this is why I was very much interested what Rainer Münz has been doing. Probably he is one of the most interesting, well-known and experienced economist who is doing the demography program, also with a lot of policy experience, because he has been working for the Juncker's Commission in his cabinet during the refugee crisis. And I'm saying this, and this is what we are going to organize it much more as a conversation in which he's going to give his insights, and I'll try to basically ask him questions. But the three things that kind of strikes me as the following. Some important things is happening due to the fact that we are living much longer than ever before. Secondly, that we are moving much easier than in many other things before. But thirdly, that all this, both our aging and our movement, are taking place in societies which are much more democracies than ever before. And how these three things are going to basically relate to each other, to what extent the fact that you have a different demographic structure of society is changing the way these societies react, to what extent basically this is changing the nature of the decision-making process and the decisions that can be taken or not taken. This was a question that interests me very much, and after that I'm going to share with you at least some of the questions that are really kind of puzzling me. But I want to start asking Rainer to basically present you in the short time the way he sees the relations demography and basically the demographic challenge in the modern society. Yeah. So to start from here, and then the idea is to open as quickly as possible for the conversations, because we have a great advantage. Our audience is not big but very high quality on the basis of what I see, and at least because for me, this is much more of an exercise to try to learn certain things for something I'm working on. So this is why. Rainer.
Ivan and I, we started this conversation in a hotel in Brussels 2 years ago. And I think Heather Grabby was with us, if I remember this correctly. And so it's an ongoing conversation that we are having. I got intrigued by this relationship. I mean, having been a demographer most of my life, or a population economist most of my life, and having worked in the Juncker cabinet for 5 years, so being close to a, democratic process, by a call of an American political scientist by the name of Dan Hamilton, which some of you might know, was at Georgetown, SAIS, Johns Hopkins, now Woodrow Wilson Center, Bosch professor, Austrian Marshall Fund professor. Anyhow, Dan, who had gotten to know me in the 1980s in Berlin, when he was the deputy director of the Aspen Institute under Shep Stone, the legendary Shep Stone, called me 30 years later and says, "Rainer, that's Dan. Hi. I I must admit that I had forgotten about this relationship that we had early on." Anyhow, Dan comes and says, "I'm going to write a book on the domestic determinants of foreign policy. And you're going to write me something on demographic change and foreign policy." That's the first time I really started systematically looking into these relationships, which I mean, everybody knows somehow that it has an influence, but I never had looked at it. And then I started to write this and circulate the text among my colleagues in the commission. And then it sounded almost like a joke when 2 years later, after the von der Leyen Commission came into office, von der Leyen decided to elevate the Croatian Commissioner Dubravka Šuica to vice president status and give her the portfolio. I mean, no portfolio, she has no means, but the title vice president for demography and democracy. Now, the people in Brussels were not so much interested in the relationship, how demographic change impacts foreign policy, but it was more out of a fear of the Brussels elites that those who are left behind. Oh, we're talking about yellow jackets, we're talking about disgruntled AfD supporters in East Germany, and so on and so forth, would undermine the European project. So an anti-liberal theme, and they thought, this has to do with demography. It's because they feel lonely. It's because this is areas where the brighter people are moving out, and we need to do something about it. So this was behind this title, Demography and Democracy, initially. And there, a commissioner from Croatia, one of the fastest shrinking countries in Europe, might have some insights. It's a bit like Margaritis Schinas, also with no means getting the title of defending the European way of life, which was more about how to deal with migrants. Anyhow, so let me just share a few thoughts with you. So there's two sides. I start with demographic change having an impact or affecting democratic processes. So the most obvious, something many of us are part of it, was this baby boomer generation growing old. Yeah, first we had a rejuvenation of the American and then of the European demography in the 1940s in the US, 50s, 60s, Europe. More Western Europe than Eastern Europe, but in both sides. Creating the baby boom. And then the baby boomers coming of age, becoming interesting voters. And these baby boomers made an interesting experience. Politics cared much about them because they represented such a large voter base, but at the same time they had specific problems related to this. Yeah? Crowded schools, crowded labor markets when they wanted to enter, crowded maternity wards when they wanted to give birth, etc. And now baby boomers are retiring, and now they are the largest, retirement constituency. So one of the interesting questions is, how does this impact, say, for example, fiscal allocation preferences? What do you think? Where are my priorities? Yeah, when you're young and a baby boomer, you want to have more teachers, more schools, investment in education. When you're a bit older, you care maybe about larger roads or better travel connections. And as you grow old, you want to see countries invest in health and old age care and secure your pension. It's no wonder that the public expenditure out of the Austrian budget into the pension system is about 4 times the money that goes into higher education and universities. Yeah, just to give. Yeah, and this this preference reflects a certain voter preference. It also has to do with the fact that older voters tend to be more conservative in the sense of voting always for the same parties, and usually not for new ones like the Greens or the Neos, in Austria, etc. But they vote for traditional Christian conservatives and social democrats in many parts. It's not just an Austrian phenomenon. Or something that interested Dan Hamilton particularly, how about their preferences in defense spending? And here I think an example we can quote, I don't know, Ivan, the two Ivans, you were already in Austria when there was a referendum on abolishing the draft and introducing a professional army. And the old people who had served, or maybe not served, they voted all in favor of keeping the draft, and the younger ones were in favor of abolishing it. As now, the older ones have more weight than the younger ones. It's like with Brexit, yeah? The older ones won. But their main concern was not about foreign policy and defense, but if you don't serve in the army, you have to do an alternative military service, and many social services catering to the needs of older people in the health and care sector are provided by these, say, unvolunteers, as you might call them, doing the alternative service. Or the question with climate change. You can say, I'm in my late 60s, I have maybe another 20, 25 years of life expectancy. Not very much is going to happen during that period. The worst to come is after that. I could say I don't care about climate change. Why should I give up part of my acquired rights and benefits in order to invest in a future that I will not see alive anymore? Huh? That's an interesting question. How to invest in public commons, to frame it more theoretically, when you will not be the beneficiary of this commons. Then it helps if you have children, because you may want to, if you don't care about yourself, you may want to care about how about people who have no children. Yeah, there's no argument. Okay. Second thing in the relationship demography is diasporas. It's evident that having diasporas of other cultures and nations on your ground can have a heavy impact on domestic politics, but also on the relations with these countries. So, violence in Israel and Palestine can have repercussions in places where you have a large Arab-Palestinian diaspora, for example. Tensions between the Kurdish and the Turkish population in Turkey itself often leads to violent conflict of Turkish and Kurdish diasporas in Berlin, in Cologne, in Vienna, in Stockholm. So, the most recent example is Turkey opposing NATO membership of Sweden and Finland. Not because Erdogan wants to help Putin, that's another thing. No, but he thinks the Swedes and the Finns are too lenient towards the Kurdish liberation movement, and this has to do with the fact that most people of Turkish origin living in Sweden and Finland are not ethnic Turks, but there's a Kurdish and Alawi or anti-Erdogan laicist, so lay people, diaspora there. So it mainly consists of refugees. You don't have this problem in Cologne and Berlin because there it's mainly the descendants of guest workers, and they are much more pro-government than the former refugees. I mean, no wonder. But I think it's a good example how a diaspora at home can have an influence. Second example, I mean, pertinent. Why on earth is the US caring about Northern Ireland? There's so many conflicts, East Timor. I mean, I can name plenty of conflicts. Nobody cares in Washington. Why? Because there's 36 million Americans who pretend to have Irish ancestry. And unlike in Ireland, where you are Catholic and Irish, or you're Protestant and Unionist, the majority of Irish Americans is not Catholic. I mean, Joe Biden and Jack Kennedy are rather exceptions, but we had also Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, even Barack Obama pretending to have Irish ancestry, because it's about their voter base and not so much about what happens in Belfast. And the best example is that the IRA, while bombing the British Army and police, were not put on a list of terrorist organizations in the US. They were allowed to do fundraisers there to buy more bombs and ammunition. I mean, believe it or not. Think of Hamas doing a fundraiser in Washington, D.C. I mean, just yeah. Okay, I'll stop here. There's plenty of examples that we can later drill on. Now, let me quickly go to the other side. Democracy influencing or using or abusing demography. And there is also plenty of examples. Also, they do not quickly come to mind because this is the direction that is usually less discussed. But you can have them, and you have democratically elected majorities, parliaments, governments, redesigning their voter base based on demographic criteria. So, migration doesn't change your population base, but not your voter base. But the question whether you naturalize people or not, or citizenship law, whether you give automatic citizenship to children born on your territory or not, has an influence who's going to be voting tomorrow, for you or against you, or not allowed to vote because you're excluded. Turn it around, whether you include your own citizens living abroad and whether you have a liberal citizenship law that allows you to pass on your citizenship abroad even without having a link to your own country materially, is also a way of including or excluding potential electorates. And you can show that the Turkish diaspora in Europe, in countries like Germany or Austria, where there is a large former labor migrant voter base, votes pro-Erdogan and AK party to a much higher degree than the people in mainland Turkey. People with voting rights, Hungary was very inclusive when it comes to extending citizenship to ethnic Hungarians or people pretending to be ethnic Hungarians in Vojvodina, in Transcarpathia, in Transylvania, in southern Slovakia. They're voting much more pro-Orban. So in case Orban would lose his majority at home, he would still have these 2-3 million potential voters outside who are voting 60, 70, 80% pro-Orban, depending on where you go. Yeah? So you can court and you see that the way countries are treating their diaspora abroad versus dealing with other diasporas at home is very different. Austria is totally opposed to dual citizenship, except if an Austrian abroad wants to become American citizen, then there is many ways of keeping that the Austrian citizenship. So you see these kind of double standards, and it exists in other areas as well. But it's a next example are exclusionary mechanisms, also based on demographic criteria. Everything that we in the US call Jim Crow laws that were intended to exclude African Americans from voting after they had gained full citizenship status, after the 1860s in the US, we're not saying people of color, but they were using demographic criteria to exclude certain categories of people. Gerrymandering of electoral districts is a good example for that. Redistricting. Final remark here. You can also see that many democratic systems give rural areas and peripheries an overproportional influence. They can send more members to parliaments than urban areas, more densely populated ones. The US Senate is a good example because a country like Montana is so small, 600,000 inhabitants, that they can have only one representative in the US, but they have 2 senators. Yeah, just California sends, 69 representatives to Congress, but also only 2 senators. So I think, but you can show it also in other places, in particular, when the number of members of parliament is not based on the number of potential voters, but on the number of inhabitants. And in cities, these inhabitants often include people with no voting rights. So they get represented by people for whom they cannot vote. Maybe they do not even support when they do it. And you can take the example of Vienna, where about 35% of the population is not voting. But the most extreme example of the cities we know better is Brussels. 60% of the population of Brussels is born outside Belgium. Most of them are people like us. They don't care about Belgian citizenship. And this is why the people representing politically the city of Brussels have a tiny electoral base. Tiny, tiny. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Ivan, this was it from my side.
Thank you very much. I'm also going to tell you from where I come in this demography conversation. Because what struck me was the political power of demographic imagination. Not simply what is happening on the level of demography, and I'm going to touch on this, but to what extent basically people imagining certain demographic developments, this affects their political behavior. I'm coming from a country which is the fastest demographically shrinking country in modern history in the absence of war or major natural disaster. In the year 1989, the population of Bulgaria was 9 million people. Now, 30 years later, it is less than 7 million people. And the reason was not particularly, our birth rates are average at Europe. We have slightly shorter life than most Europeans, but the biggest story was out-migration. So a lot of people left the country after opening of the borders. And this is a story that is known to many countries. Simply in Bulgaria, for many reasons, it was slightly more dramatic. But what was interesting, and this is the first thing that shocked me, was to what extent the demographic shrinking of a nation is associated with the idea of a cultural and political decay and decline. Suddenly you start panicking of losing population. Suddenly this becomes a political problem, to the extent that there is a beautiful Bulgarian novel being written, published just 2 years ago by Alek Popov, a well-known Bulgarian writer. And this is the story of a country very much resembling Bulgaria, in which the president understood that the population is going under 7 million. And he knows that he cannot be elected if this is going to be the case, because he's going to be blamed for the demographic decline. At the same time, the president was elected during the refugee crisis, so he cannot open the border for foreigners, because the major story was Bulgaria for Bulgarians, so what you're doing. So they sent anthropologists to find Bulgarians somewhere. And they found in Central Asia a certain tribe that resembles anthropologically Bulgarians, and he gave them citizenship, and they got this European citizenship, but unfortunately, instead of coming to the elections and to vote for the president, they went to France and Germany. This is a good story, but the most important is why it's so dramatic. And this is not simply about Bulgaria. And I'll start with my first observation is democracy is a numbers game. And in a certain way, when we tell the story of a democratic change, we normally say government is changing because people are changing their mind. But government can change also because the population is changing.
Yeah.
For example, big migration waves of Soviet Jews going to Israel after the war. And this is changing the electoral body to the extent that people are not changing their mind, but this can change the government. Or big out-migration, and government can change without a single person changing their mind. How this also relates to this kind of a new identity politics and much more mobility. And in my view, this was the second thing that I found particularly interesting, is that in the United States, a very interesting study has been done where they are interviewing 2 samples of people, as you can imagine, very comparable samples. The difference between them was only that one of the people were given the information that according to the statistical projections, the white Americans, and how you're defining white Americans is a totally different conversation now, but white Americans in 2044 are not going to be the majority ethnic group. And then they start polling these 2 groups on every question concerning racism, minority rights, and so on, and they discovered that suddenly this sample that knew that this was only white people, that knew that their own ethnic group is going to become a minority, became much more conservative and reactionary is answering in all of these questions. Suddenly the fear that you're losing your majority status is becoming critically important. And then comes the third question that interested me. And this was the questions which, in my view, President Trump represents very well. Because in 2016, when President Trump was very much going in his election campaign, he has a rally, and in this rally he said, if you're not going to vote for me today, the Republican Party is never going to be in power anymore, because the Democrats are going to come, they're going to open the border, they're going to give all the citizens' right to the migrants, and they're going to have a government of their own. Listen, pragmatically, this is bullshit. From how basically migrants vote, and there is a lot of study shows that you cannot predict the voting behavior of a different groups, but it worked. And why it worked? And this is the fear that it's not simply that people are electing the government, the fear is that government can elect its own people. And this goes very much to the story that basically you're talking about Hungary, where you have a totally different way of voting. In a certain way, in Hungary, if you're living, for example, in Serbia or Romania and others, you can vote by post. But if you're living in London or in Berlin, you should go and vote in the embassy. So in a certain way, all these stories of how the numbers are changing is based on the assumptions, and for me this was, I'm going to stop in 2 minutes, on the assumptions that we know how people vote, how different ethnic groups vote. To a certain extent in the United States is very much universalization of the experience of the black voters who have a strong loyalty to one of the political parties. But we know that, for example, in Germany, there was a lot of studies showing that, for example, when the immigrant Turks became German citizens, they're voting in a very different way. They're changing their votes. Different generation of voters are voting differently. So here's my question, and this is why, for me, economic dimension was interesting. So then I will try to imagine how my own country, Bulgaria, is going to look in 20 years. Obviously, we should try to open the labor market. This is critical with the aging population and others, and it starts happening. By the way, many of the Ukrainian refugees that are coming, Bulgarian population is happy to have them staying. Nevertheless, that you're going to see noise here and there, talk to the business community, and they said, we want these people to stay. They're culturally very close, and they're going to be easily integrated in the labor market. So imagine that this process is going to develop, and imagine in 20 years, the body politics of Bulgaria looking like this. 20% of the people who are active on the labor market do not have right to vote, in the way we don't have the right to vote on the Austrian elections. It does not mean that I don't have a voting rights. I have a voting rights in Bulgaria, but I don't have a voting rights in the place in which I'm living, basically in the countries in which you're a long time, and European Union is making it very easy. Secondly, around 40% of the Bulgarian voters are going to be on the retirement age because you have an aging population. And then you have a lot of people who are living abroad, those like me. I can vote on the Bulgarian elections, but I'm not paying taxes in Bulgaria. And this divorce between social and economic rights on one level and political rights, this idea is where is the center of your life and what is the meaning of politics when this is not about economy, this is about something else, it's about belonging. To what extent European Union makes it very easy, because while I'm not voting in Austria, I don't feel deprived in the way the black Americans felt deprived in the South, because I'm voting in my own country. In my view, this was the idea that this was a question that was not really seriously discussed in Europe. And this is very much connected to the new situation and very much to the European Union. And here comes my last point, which comes from a country which I discovered when I started to be interested in these demographic issues. So there is a beautiful country called South Korea. Prosperous, interesting country where the birth rate is 0.4 child per woman. We are talking about a very rich place which is investing quite a lot of money in kindergartens, in social services. But obviously, and I'm not specialist on Korea, there is something wrong with the Korean marriage patterns. There is obviously something wrong with the role of the women basically in society. But for reasons that we're not going to discuss because I'm not competent to discuss, almost 40% of the young Korean women, they don't go they never married. They basically never had children. And then what is happening in a society which, if this is going to be the case, and this is a very close society for migration, in 20 years they're going to lose 50% of their population. Then, of course, you're imagining what is going to be the structure of the population in which people are living longer and longer, and there are going to be less and less kids. And how this affects the idea of the future, what you're saying, how basically the time horizon of democracy is defined by the biggest generation in a society. This is my first question, which goes to you. Secondly, what kind of problems you are going to allow elections to decide in a society in which you have such a divorce between the people who are politically active and people who are active on the labor market? Can democracy basically function the same way it was functioning before? And thirdly, and for me this is very interestingly, how this is changing the nature of the social contract. And I'm going to put it in a very simple way. Burke was saying that the social contract is a contract between those who lived before us and our kids. But imagine a contract between we are not much talking about those who have been living before us, and we are not sure that the kids are going to be our kids. With a much more migration-driven society, is the social contract the same contract? So this is the questions that comes to me, and now it comes to you to answer all of them.
So, yes, Korea is an interesting example. If you travel just a couple of hundred kilometers further east, you get into Japan. Japan has also a very low birth rate, an overaged society. So, to aging, this is the most, the most advanced society concerning aging is the Vatican. But if you forget about this example of the Vatican, which has the oldest population on the globe, lowest fertility rate, high mortality, etc. So,
it's good.
Japan is next, right? With real people, a better gender balance than in this tiny spot in Rome. Anyhow. And the Koreans and the Japanese are struggling with the same phenomenon, that their gender roles and the way women find a place in society and on the labor market does not fit with this expectation of having children at the same time. And more educated women decide against children. But this is a phenomenon that is not only confined to Korea and Japan. It also explains why educated Italian women, for example, don't have plenty of children. The Koreans have decided they will open their society to immigrants. The Japanese have decided never ever. And it's going to be very interesting to see how these two, don't tell them, but rather similar societies concerning values and cultural background, etc., will, and degree of industrialization will diverge in the coming years. There's another interesting real experiment that is happening without, the people responsible for it ever having planned for it, and this is the one-child policy in China, which will probably, parallel Bulgaria and Croatia as quickest shrinking society. So for the rest of the 21st century, population of China is going to go down. Plus, also interesting, here China is not a democracy. This is why we're not going to get deeper into it, but it's an interesting experiment of thought. Because of one-child policy, you had selective abortion in China over 4 decades. Yeah, everybody wanted to have a son, nobody wanted to have a daughter. Now we have many provinces in China where there is about 125 young men for every 100 young women. They will never find a partner, forget about having kids. China is probably not possible to have a large import of African women or of Africans in general. The society is just not ready for that. But we are outside the democratic territory, so I'm not going to elaborate on that, but it will be the third interesting East Asian case to monitor when it comes on dealing with that. Now, in principle, there is a solution to that. You abolish retirement. Not very popular in Europe, but this is something, there's a path. Japan is going down to it. Many people are retiring pro forma, and then they spend a day at home, and then they go back to their old company, work for much less or for love, and continue doing something. That's a way of avoiding immigration, but it's extremely unpopular. And there, I think this would bring me back to one of these voter dilemmas. You're right, no taxation without representation is exactly the opposite of what is happening today. Many people are paying taxes, have no voting rights. Many people have voting rights, but are not paying taxes in the place where they vote. Yes, that's increasing. That's increasing. But the interesting thing is that an aging society, governments in aging societies face a triple dilemma which they cannot escape. If they keep retirement age where it is, they will either have to spend a lot more on pensions, which reduces the possibility to invest in other areas, So it's an allocation problem that would require unpopular decisions, or to reduce pension payments, which is also unpopular. So the alternatives, working longer, paying more into the system without getting more out of it, or accepting large-scale immigration, are the, how you say, terrible options. Yeah, I'm gonna, Ivan and I, we're gonna create, or the two Ivans and I are gonna create the party of truth. We tell you the demographic truth. Vote for us, you will get less for paying in more, will bring more immigrants, and you will not retire when you think. Yeah, that's the base. So we're going to be elected by 2 or 3 people who think, oh, finally somebody says the truth, and by a few idiots who don't understand what we are talking about, and that's it. But basically, democratically elected governments who are struggling to get re-elected are facing that tough choice. There is no alternative to it. Yeah, this is, you can't escape. And we are coming, and that's interesting also to see about les 30 Glorieuses, economic miracle in the post-war period. There was a period where society was getting younger through the baby boom, and thanks to the people who had died during World War II, you had half a generation of men not retiring, and so not burdening the system. An ideal situation for every old person, you have 5 or 6 young productive people. In Europe, we had that just 2 or 3 decades ago. And from there on, you can say, nobody told the people the party's over. Now, there's not going to be a large cohort entering the labor market from below, but there will be many people who want to retire. The sooner the better in countries like France or Turkey or Bulgaria or Austria or wherever. This is outside the more Protestant areas, a quite universal pattern. So how are governments going to face that? Pensions at the level that can be financed create a fiscal problem, because you will not get enough to sustain your living. Pensions at the level that give you a good life, 80% of what you had before retirement, cannot easily be financed without overburdening the next generation, who's going to be smaller, or consisting of migrants who have no voting rights. And so that's the full circle. Back to you.
Thank you. I'll back and then I'll go back to you. But just to continue, because as you see, we're much more kind of trying to see the problems that we see. We're not talking this. But for me, there was also 3 other issues. Obviously, demographic transition, by the way, is very well explained. This is very universal. You have before societies which are based on a very high birth rates, but also very high child mortality. And then child mortality started to improve, while the birth rates for a while have been still higher. And then you have this major kind of increase of population. And then now, for the first time, we're seeing a problem which is not based, I mean, in Europe and in Asia, it's totally different in Africa, where the problem is not the increase of the population, which everybody was Malthusian fears of before, but we have the fear of depopulation. You're losing population, you have an aging population, you have a kind of a how to deal with this situation. And interestingly is how education play in this. The education, and particularly the education of women, turns to be one of the most important factors that is basically defining the demographic transition. Basically, there is a very strong correlations between the percent of the educated women and what is the situation with birth rates and others. I'm saying this because South Korea is amazing, exactly because this is one of the societies that is obsessed with education. Highly meritocratic society, getting a good education. And in a certain way, what is changing it, what it means to be able to have a children, and to be able to have children is not simply to give them food and so on that many people believed before, and of course the end of the agricultural dominance very much changed the need of this labor, but how many kids you can sustain paying for them to go to great universities, investing in their private lessons and others. So the question between this kind of a fixation of education, and particularly education of the next generation, and all the choices about giving birth or not giving birth I found important, because the other two things that I found particularly important was to what extent demographic fears can explain things that otherwise looks totally unrelated to them. I have been following President Putin's speeches for a long time, and what I discovered is that from the very first moment he entered the presidential palace, he was totally fixated on the demographic decline of the Russian population that came after the end of the Soviet Union. So he was making a big issues, and one of his major praises of his government in the mid 2010s was that he managed to change the demographic dynamics. In fact, then specialist demographers said that the major reason was the anti-alcohol campaign of President Gorbachev. This is what he benefited from. But this idea of losing people in a world in which the population around you is increasing is becoming incredibly traumatic, to the extent that in the last 3 months before the war, the Russian president 3 times made a statement that nobody was asking him for. He said in 19th century, Mendeleev made the predictions that in 21st century there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. But you see, there was the revolution, there was the war, and so on, and you know how many we are now. Even now you have around 1 million Ukrainians that have been taken from Ukraine and took into the Russia proper. I'm saying this because this fear of demographic lack of people, which is totally starting to replace the fear of a lack of land that you have before. Normally it was about territory, about land. And now you have the fear that there is not enough people, and particularly enough of you, enough of your own group. And this becomes very important because, and I'm going to end of this, as you know, many of the populist parties, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, are totally fascinated by the state of Israel. And knowing the background of some of their voters, this does not come very naturally, because you have political parties that have a very strong kind of anti-Semitic backgrounds, and even some of them continue to be quite anti-Semitic in their attitudes, but they're totally fascinated. If there is a model, this is the state of Israel. So what is the thing that Israel did so well? Of course, many things. Very successful economic development based on high technologies, strong military nuclear power. But there is one thing more about which many of these leaders like to talk. This is the only Western nation that managed to reverse its demographic decline. I'm not talking about the migration of people coming to Israel, but also because of a very high birth rates of the religious Jews. This is the only, basically, Western nation that managed to reverse this demographic decline. And in the rhetoric of the populist parties, and this is true not only for Eastern Europe, go to Zemmour and basically to France and others, these capabilities to have children again is becoming a new model of greatness. So I want to open this, not so much they could be questions, but they could be also observation discussions. I'm sure that all of you have been thinking about this, but at least my line of argument is the following. There are 2 types of imaginations that are shaping, in my view, politics in 21st century, at least now, more than anything else. One is the demographic imagination and the fear there are not going to be any of us, that my way of life is going to disappear. And then there is a kind of a climate imagination, the fear that there is not going to be life at all, that basically the earth is going to die. And this type of imagination has a very strong representation, by the way, in a very different groups of societies. But all of them share something very important, incredible intensity. But secondly, out of the title of the Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man, kind of the end of history is removed, but the idea of the last man is remaining. You're starting to live as if you're the last man, the last representatives of your nation, the last representative of your generation. This kind of a fixation on this kind of a demographic profile I found very interesting, and this is why, coming with these questions, we are coming back to you. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Amanda Coakley and I'm a Europe's Futures Fellow here at the IWM. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today. So, when it comes to democracy and demography, I really think that Northern Ireland is the front line, and I think that a lot of our discussion today should really be focused on Northern Ireland. Why? Because why is it a surprise to so many people that Sinn Féin got 29% of the vote in Northern Ireland last week? And even more so, I think there is an argument for the surprise in the Sinn Féin result in the last election in the Republic, but certainly not when we look at the demographic changes in Northern Ireland, should that result come as a surprise. On a side note, I think we need to be very careful when we talk about Northern Ireland and break it down in such brute terms as Catholic is Irish and Protestant is English. Traditionally, yes, but more so today in Ireland, I think that the issue, especially of reunification, has become in broad strokes that breakdown. But the minutiae, when you spend time in Northern Ireland, is far more dynamic, if you want to call it that. So I suppose my first question to both of you is why were there not discussions in places like Brussels after the Brexit vote about Northern Ireland and demographic changes? Was everyone blindsided by the results in Northern Ireland last week? And if everyone was blindsided, then where is the next Northern Ireland going to be? So that's kind of on that one point. You can probably take from my accent, I am Irish, hence the interest in Northern Ireland. And as well, another issue when it comes to educated women. We spoke about Japan, but of course the same issue about educated women is coming up in Poland and Hungary in particular. I think that we need to be very careful about talking about the demographic responsibility being shifted onto women, in particular educated women, when in reality a still male-dominated political ecosystem doesn't put in place the infrastructure needed to support a modern family. So it is not so much about educated women choosing not to have children, it is actually our male colleagues don't put the infrastructure in place that we need to raise a family. And on a side note, many educated women all around the world, they want to have a larger family, but they can't afford it, as Ivan said. So I suppose I'm throwing it back to you. What can men in politics do to put to the fore paid maternity leave, proper support, child support, in Europe and beyond, and how can our male politicians in Europe lobby our male politicians outside of Europe to ensure that those systems are put in place for women?
Yeah, just two remarks. I'm looking at the Northern Ireland case since about 25, 30 years, and I started looking at it when there was about 50% more Protestants than Catholics in Northern Ireland, some 30 years ago. But it was clear because of a higher fertility rate on one side, but also out-migration. It's rather unionists moving to the UK than Irish Catholics from Northern Ireland moving to the UK. So you had a differentiated out-migration pattern, and you had a significantly higher fertility 30 years ago among Catholics than among Protestants. This is no longer the case. But it was clear that they would gain momentum. And so you could say when it's going to be a Catholic majority, and 18, 20, 30 years later, this translates into an electoral majority. Then something that is not easy to predict is people not aligning themselves, alliance party people, so voting for a third party. We have the same phenomenon now in Lebanon. Yeah. Where people are refusing to vote for these parties, etc. But the amazing thing that I learned when walking with my wife in New York and looking at the St. Patrick's Day parade, today you have people of all colors running with trifles. And being Irish in the US is not related to Catholicism. Yeah? Whereas in Northern Ireland, it's almost not possible to be a Catholic and unionist, or to be a Protestant and say I'm vote for Sinn Féin and my heart is bleeding for unification. There it doesn't work. Whereas, I don't know, Bill Clinton can stand there. I remember Good Friday Agreement, 1998. Clinton was standing there like this, and said, I, as a Protestant Irishman, I tell you. And you could hear the in the room. It was in his speech, he had this one line that was really astonishing people, where he referred to his Irishness, but also to the fact that he was not a Catholic. So anyhow, there's going to be a Catholic majority, electoral-wise, and this will lead to unification, and the beautiful Irish Republic is going to inherit a terrible problem because they are not prepared to deal with that kind of diversity. Ireland will have to learn how to deal with non-Catholics, people not loyal to Ireland, not subscribing to the Irish idea. It's something that Ireland is not prepared for, the South. Yeah, so you can only predict that a good deal of Irish domestic politics in the future is not going to be about reunification, but about integrating citizens who don't want to be Irish citizens. And that will be an interesting case. Women and demography. Ivan is totally right. When you look at fertility and also GDP development, education of women is more important than the education of men. It has more impact. So if you want to have an impact investment, you should do more for women. The fact that educated women then have fewer children goes by itself because you have more choices. It's about options in a place like Kenya or in a place like Nigeria. When you are not educated, when you live outside the cash economy, when you get married against your will or without being asked at age 14, there is much less possibility to choose. Yeah, the fertility is not just your own choice. If you have just more means to choose, if you are not married at age 20, if you still go to university, if you have a career in front, if the idea of not having as many children as possible, but children as educated as possible, like you have alluded to for the case of Korea, or you can also talk about Japan or China or Singapore, wherever, creates a different pattern. Now, in Europe, you're absolutely right that it's not a responsibility of women just to, procreate and to replace themselves by, or men and women by the next generation. Absolutely not. In Europe, you can see it's not even the cash transfer, but it's exactly this institutional setting that you were talking about, and it's gender equality to a certain degree that creates a higher number of children per family. This is basically Scandinavia and France and Belgium. There's some other areas where I cannot tell you why. Northern Romania has one of the highest fertility rates relative in Europe, where I don't see this pattern. But what's important for understanding the low fertility in southern, southeastern, and parts of Eastern Europe is something that you could call this gender equality or a macho index. Having a bunch of machos as your choice as partners doesn't make them more attractive today. And so, because the machos don't want to care about these children, yeah, they think it's not their duty. They want to have children, but they don't want to care about them. And in a situation where because you are well educated as a woman, your economic future does not depend on the man, yeah, you have the option. You have an alternative option that women in the past often did not have. And this opens an avenue to decide freely. I would like to have children, but not with this kind of man that I'm surrounded with. And this is why I'm not doing that. This is part of it's a rational choice, I think. But you can definitely say it comes at a price because you have to forgo your wish to have children to a certain degree. I'm not saying that these women are not don't want to have children, but what you see is when you have a culture that schools are open only in the morning, yeah? There is no childcare facilities sufficient to support women enough. You have mothers-in-law who look down on you or despise you if you put your children into kindergartens because they think it's your duty to do that. Yeah, this is a culture that does not create a high fertility environment. In the past, it may have. If the identity gain for women was to have children, becoming a mother. And there's still cultures in the world where you can see that. Yeah? Egypt is a counterexample. Egypt has a high degree of educated women, but there's no labor market for these women. And Egypt is one of the countries where this secular decline in fertility was reverted at a certain point, when you had more educated women not finding jobs, and then having children. I'm not saying instead, but you could see that. There's practical examples. Whereas in Tunisia, where you have the same level of education, but many more women working, Tunisia has a fertility rate below 2. So I think it's 1.6 or something like that. So that's below France and Sweden. So I think you have to look at it country by country. There are some general patterns, but some of the analysis needs to really, I mean, you have to look at it. You have to see this. Yeah? Take countries like Israel. You have these Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox people having 5, 6 children, very early marriage, often arranged, made. People don't know each other. And you have the same on the Arab side. You have also extremist Muslim communities who are saying having as many children as possible is your duty, something like that. Yeah? I think you need to really look at group by group in order to really understand the dynamics of fertility decline and its implication. It's a universal trend that has started in Europe 200 years ago and is reaching now a country like Niger. But it's really, to understand the exact dynamics, you need to look at it country by country. I mean, that's my advice, or my learning from looking at these data. But I cannot say I understand each case myself.
Very much. I'll go from a slightly different perspective, because first of all, I very much agree even more. This type of a war on women that is very seen in places like Poland and others. And here is where, for me, this kind of a climate imagination and demographic imagination come with a totally different moral imperatives. Basically, if you're very conservative Paul caring about your nation shrinking, every woman that has less than 2 children basically is not patriotic enough. And you're saying why you're not doing this. If you're a young environmentalist and you're seeing basically what is happening to the climate, the question is, any kid that you're going to give birth to, in a certain way, is contributing to the problem of the Earth. So from this point of view, you have 2 very different imaginations which have a totally 2 different moral imperatives when it comes to the women. One said, get 3, 4, 5. The other said, are you sure that you want? And in my view, this is interesting because they're very strong and they're fighting with each other. But the second is, and this is the Northern Ireland story, the fact that you know how different groups are going to vote based on their religion or ethnicity gives me an explanation for things that I was always very much puzzled by. There is a science fiction story by Isaac Asimov from 1950s. And this is telling the story of American elections in 2008, when Obama was elected. So how the elections took place? You have a normal campaign, you have parties and so on, but people are not voting. There is this big computer which is taking the preferences of the people, but on the election day, the computer is singling out one voter, the switch voter. And in front of the nation, basically, the computer has a conversation with this switch voter, and it's also trying to basically see his reactions. And at the night of the elections, they declared who is the candidate who is going to be the president of the United States. So strangely enough, you have the preferences of the people being taken into account by the computer, but people are not voting. And as a result of it, these are elections on which nobody can celebrate on the election day. In a certain way, you cannot have the idea of a collective victory of my party over your party. This kind of idea that democracy is totally not divisive. You have a very diverse preferences, you have diverse interests, but I managed to synthesize anything. And you're talking to these people, by the way, not asking him for whom you're going to vote, but asking him around 30 or 40 questions on which he's giving an answer, just to be sure that you're getting right certain type of things. This I found very much interesting, because the part of the problem that I see with the rise of the identity politics in some places, particularly ethnic diverse society or racially diverse society, is that in a certain way you start to believe that you know how people are voting. That, for example, Northern Ireland, you're Catholic, I know how Catholics vote. You're Protestant, I know how Protestant vote. You're Bulgarian, or you're Bulgarian Turk, I know how you're going to vote and not vote. And this is kind of, this fear of diversity, in my view, is stronger in a democratic societies than in any other societies. Michael Mann has this classical work in which he shows that, for example, ethnic cleansing and genocides are much more typical for the democratic citing societies than for the classical authoritarian regime. Because classical authoritarian regime, not taking seriously the rights of anybody, is not so much afraid of this type of political representation, while basically for the democratic society, I want to be sure that I have the right to expel. So this is where I'm going to stop and basically invite you again for. And also observation. It does not need to be questioned. It could be also your reflections on it. Toby.
I was thinking about Israel again. And I was interested in your views about Eric Kaufman, the political scientist's argument about the fifth demographic transition, that the first four transitions were about changes in material conditions, and the fifth transition is about belief, which is to say you have people in society who have the same educational outcomes, the same access to healthcare, the same experience the same mortality rates, and what differentiates between them is their beliefs. And so in Israel and in sections of the United States, women and families of similar educational background have very different numbers of children because they're religious. And do you think that that trend is likely to continue on, if it's meaningful for the way that politics is conducted, first of all in the United States and in Israel, but also further afield?
When you look at data, you see that the number of religious people is growing. But this had to do with population growth. You just have rapid population growth among Christians and Catholics in Africa and among Muslims in Western Asia. But within societies, the trend in Europe, and for a long time also in the Arab world, was secularism. So fewer and fewer people becoming true believers. The US is a counterexample. There you don't see this general trend of the society. When you look at these Pew data, you don't see that.
Secularization, Pew is about questions, but if you see the church attendance, you have a decline also in the United States, and particularly among the younger generation. The level of secular Americans is much higher.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Anyhow, but the people saying I believe in God in the US is quite stable. In Israel, the growth of true believers has to do with a higher number of children among people who are not secular, defining not themselves as secular. When David Ben-Gurion was exempting these very orthodox people from military service, he was talking about 500 people or something like that in the whole state of Israel. Today we know it's, 15 to 20% of the next generation that is exempt from military service because they belong to these groups. So there is a clear trend in this direction. And on the Arab side, we also clearly see that there was a tendency towards secularism. Clearly, Nasser was a secular leader. Saddam Hussein was a secular leader. It was Arab nationalism. It was not we are all Muslims. The same tendency in Turkey. And there you see the ascent of political movements and of leaders who define themselves via the fact that they are Muslims. Yeah, it's very clear with Erdogan, but also in his last days of reign, Saddam Hussein tried to stick to that. And something that is not fully easy to understand is that the West has aligned itself with the religious groups against the secular forces. We have toppled Gaddafi, who clearly was a secular Arab nationalist leader, not a man waving the green flag. We have toppled Saddam Hussein, who definitely for most of the time was on the secular side and not on the religious side, also knowing that the religious majority would be Shia Muslims not never voting or supporting him. We have tried to get rid of Assad, despite the fact that he represents a more secular version against Sunni Muslim radicals. And they were not the only ones opposing him, but they were the most, the ones that Saudi Arabia and the US and Europe was arming because they were the most efficient fighters. We have, so it's an interesting alliance of the West with the anti-secular forces in the Middle East. Nobody had.
But one of the reasons is that the secular forces were quite genocidal themselves.
Yes.
You can be secular and kind of killing quite a lot of people.
But as long as Saddam Hussein was killing the right people, we had no problem with that. It's only when he started turning against Kuwait and,
No. My major argument is that secular religious divide cannot explain everything, because some of this type of a secular dictatorship, exactly because they represent minority groups, tend to be extremely repressive, because basically you should keep under control basically majorities which are very different from you. And here they're crossing certain red line, which is very difficult for the Western powers. For example, Saddam Hussein was typical. This was also with the Kurds, which were not particularly religious and so on. So from my point of view, it cannot explain, you cannot say that Western governments suddenly discovered the charm of religious communities, but it is much more on the base of other factors and calculations that they took the position they took.
Ivan, I fully agree with that. Yeah. I fully agree with that. I just say the outcome is a much less secular Middle East. It's a much less secular Middle East. When you look how Baghdad is looking today, you see the change in Cairo. When I first came to Cairo, women with a wheel were poor fringe populations coming from the countryside. But this is no longer the case. Same with Istanbul. So something is happening there. Sure. Something's happening there that goes against this general trend. The world is becoming more secular.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Please.
Thank you very much for a totally fascinating panel. I have just some scattered comments. The first, Ivan, is related to what you were saying just a moment ago, and it's connected to the case of the U.S. And it really has to do with what happens to public persuasion when the premise that demography is destiny becomes central to the way that political parties think about the task of essentially winning elections. So I'm thinking of the incoherence on the part of the Democratic Party, which largely does reason, I think, on the basis for maybe 2 decades now, on the basis of this idea that essentially this kind of rising non-white population is going to lead inevitably to electoral victories. And it's not, there are significant signs that it's not working out. And you talk about demographic imagination. I think it leads to a lack of political imagination to essentially let this kind of idea that demography is destiny do the work for you. Conversely, on the Republican side, I connect very much this, this notion that essentially populations are declining with the way the apartheid state in South Africa thought about white populations. That's a white minority can govern very, very stably with great repressive techniques on the basis of these anxieties for a long, long time. And this is very persuasive when it comes to something like replacement theory, for example. in the U.S. So it's a kind of, because the topic today is demography and democracy, and because I take it to be the case that democracy really does presuppose the capacity of deliberative bodies to persuade each other and argue with each other, it seems to me that demography really figures into the way we use words. As you were saying, I don't need to listen to you if I know your democracy. The other question is not really, it's related to the question of foreign policy, which I want to bring back. I was talking to a Chinese colleague of mine who was saying that the reason why China is going to be more peaceable for the next couple of decades has to do with the one-child policy and has to do with the unwillingness of Chinese families to lose their children in war. Okay, I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I connect it to the idea of the conscript army and to the shifts in the way that military technology, the shifts in the way that warfare is taking place. Through, for example, highly technological means. So I guess it's just a question of like, it's more of an invitation, the second point. Do you buy this idea that essentially demography can be predictive of certain foreign policy choices in the case, for example, of like, you know, the one-child policy? And then secondly, I guess the corollary of that would be in cases where you have a kind of, not a conscript army, but a kind of highly technological army, does the exact opposite hold? So, for example, far from being the case that a kind of small population of young people can predict peaceful populations, the kind of technological imaginary, to the contrary, dictates highly militaristic choices, because a small number of people can basically have a large impact. So that second question is more of a kind of invitation to talk more about foreign policy and democracy.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you very much. First, there was quite a lot of studies that showing that the bigger group of the younger population basically increases the risk of a social conflict, war and destabilization, and this was going very much with this. You can see that stabilized populations, basically aging populations and so on, are becoming kind of a less war-prone. But here comes your great question about conscript technology and basically mother's war. One of the things that if you have 10 or 12 children, like my grandmother used to have, obviously losing a child in a war is not the same if you have one children. And the biggest problem of the conscript army came, and this is best seen in the United States during the Vietnam War, that you have a middle-class families with 2 kids, and one of them is going to be killed. And then you have this famous theory of the mother's war, in which basically you cannot go and really, you don't want to fight, you are not very much interested to lose a lot of people, you are changing the way you're fighting, because you should reduce at minimum the number of losses that you can get, because otherwise you're afraid to face what the United States faced in 1970s. Here, of course, comes the highly technological story. And this is changing the calculus totally. Because when you have all these drones and others, of course you need less people. It's a much more professional army. But also, honestly speaking, people manage to alienate their armed forces from themselves. The idea of the professional army, you're not so much outraged when a professional soldier is killed, and this is true everywhere, than when a conscript is killed. And this was very clear, by the way, in the Russian debate in the beginning of the war. A Russian president went and said, there is no conscripts. This don't turn to be true, but it doesn't matter. It's so important to tell to the people, it's not your kids, these are people who made a choice to go and to die. And I find this very interesting. And of course, Samoin has this very important recent book in which he said that the fact that we started to have a high technology and precision weapons make the war much more easier today, because it's easier to have the wars in which you're killing not many people, and particularly you're not going to be killed. But I agree very much with you that there is something, a certain type of a correlations between the general age of society and the number of kids, and generally the risk that you're going to take, not simply on the level of war, but even some of the economic risks. The big family and many kids are a type of insurance. You can have on a family level, have a different choices, which is not the case if you have one daughter or one son, and you don't have the right to fail in a way. But probably Rainer has something more interesting to do.
Let's go back to
Yeah, please. Yeah, Professor Dan and then Mario.
Thank you very much. I think I probably need this. Inaudible otherwise. Two things really. One, from ignorance, but I think it may be important, and is, if it is important, sort of pretty purely demographic. I believe it to be the case that anyway in the richer countries in the world, it's true that there's a pretty precipitous decline in human fertility, which is not, which is pre-impregnation.
Yeah.
And I think that that is bound to be very important indeed in how the dynamics of this work out over time, because that seems to be fairly clearly connected with the relation with the way that modern industrial structures work over time and modern medical practices work over time. And they're just, it's a process of cumulative ecological poisoning, really. As I said, I don't know anything about that, but I believe it to be true. And if it is true, it's obviously extraordinarily important in this general subject. The other thing which I'm more confident about is I think it's a mistake to think about the relationship between democracy and demography as though democracy was a fairly clearly structured feature of the world. I just think that is a really muddled way of thinking. You are not going to end up with clear and accurate judgments if you do think on that premise, because it's complete rubbish. And I think particularly the view which acquired a certain amount of greater historical credibility in the years, let's say, between 1948 and 1973, that it was reasonable to expect representative democracies in a capitalist world to produce generally benign policy outcomes which were actually beneficial from the point of view of the populations concerned. I think that you could just simply say, well, if you actually follow this story from 1973 to 2022, and you don't even include foreign relations at all, it's clear that that judgment is sensationally misplaced. And that's a deep causal fact about the way we think, which we have not begun to take the measure of.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right. Mario?
Yes, I just wanted to continue this conversation about the confessional differences in democracy. Some time ago I wrote a book on the Christian-Muslim frontier, and I had a section on demography. Well, especially when you look at the Middle East, the Balkans, you see like a kind of a competition. Take, for example, the Orthodox Christian Serbs and the Muslim Albanians, and Albanians in Kosovo and Macedonia have a higher fertility rate than Albanians in Albania. And when you talk to them, sometimes they say that it's part of the competition. So I was, and also in Bulgaria, like one of the excuses of the communist regime for changing the names of the Muslim Turks was that they had calculated that they had like on the average 3 kids, while the Bulgarians, Orthodox Bulgarians, had less than 2. So that's why they were calculating how, in what time the Turks, the Muslim Turks, will become equal in numbers. So they wanted to reverse that, and they changed the names. So the idea is that it's not a question of doctrinal issues. It's an issue of religion being a factor of transmitting the sense of belonging. And it will become...
Sorry.
So, like I live in Switzerland, and in Switzerland there are referenda quite often, And you can see, like, you can easily say, I was predicting that one of the things that you said, okay, Europe is secular. But when you come to these kind of frequent referenda, etc., you see that it's a latent issue. Like in Switzerland, there were referenda, for example, on minarets. And people voted against the minarets. So if you travel around Switzerland, you can see mosques, but without minarets, because there was a vote not to have minarets, because for like the parties that were against the minarets were saying, well, these are symbols of the predominance of Islam. So they got that referenda going, and there were other referenda on whether civil servants should cover their hair. Well, my daughter has 1/3 of her classmates were Muslim, so even the parents, like the mothers of those kids, were pushing us, saying, well, look, vote for the right to wear those scarves. But the general vote was against the scarves for civil servants. So, and in France, again, they also had this issue. So this is something that should not be kept under the carpet, because it will come up, like populist politicians will more and more use that. I remember Ivan was mocking a bit the situation in France when somebody was kind of, when Muslims all of us, because of this dynamics, win the elections, etc. But what is your opinion? Like, will that confessional difference in Europe always be kept down because of the declared secularism of the European Union, or it will come up with the populist politics, for example?
Listen, I do believe the differences can come up. Confessional is one of them. It could be different. What really interests me is the demographic determinism, and this was very much goes to the question before. There is an old book by Przeworski on paper stones. And the story was that back then, the Marxist parties expected that one day the workers are going to be the majorities of society. And the problem was to wait for them to become a majority. So are you going to have a kind of a party that is going to be only for workers and not allowing anybody else to vote for them, just waiting while the industrial development is going to produce your own majority, or are you going to catch up and try to get other voters in order to win as soon as possible? And he was showing different choices between different parties, particularly in Scandinavia and others. And what I find particularly interesting, and this is the examples everybody is giving, is I don't know to what extent you can vote for one or different things on different reasons. I can decide to vote against, for example, the cover or for, regardless of the fact what is my basically religious identity or not. But the interesting is that people will start to explain what I'm doing based on this. And then this is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, because this is an identity which is made on you, and you can decide for totally different issues. And then if you believe in this demographic determinism, then you're obsessed with starting numbering people, counting. How many of you, how many of us? How many of you, how many of us? And of course, talking about the United States, this is most interesting about the Democratic Party, because you're counting people, but you're not always asking how they want to be counted. And the most interesting story was with the Latino. You believe that you basically are making a favor to them as counting them Latino, but probably some of them want to be count whites in the way basically Irish or Italians turned to be whites much later than they entered in the process. But why people are going to behave in a much more flexible way, this is why demographic imagination based on demographic determinism I find important for modern politics. You start living with projections. I'm going to end here in order to people have the last round and go to ask Rainer, but what struck me during the COVID pandemic is that how quickly projections are becoming reality that you're living with. how many people are going to die in 2 months, 3 months. It's a mathematical models. It's a serious story. But you're starting and taking them as a data and reality that has already happened. This is already as a facts when basically people are modeling what is going to happen. And the same is happening in the demographic field. Suddenly, there was a famous book by an American author about how many Africans are going to be in Europe and basically how many they're going to live in the next 40 years. And every 6 person living in Europe. We don't know. Listen, many things can happen till then. We don't know. But the problem with demography is it looks predictable. And in my view, this idea that you can project and you can live with a future in which, while you're a majority now, you're imagining yourself being a minority, very much is going to define this type of politics and probably explain at least some of the political developments that we see. But I'm stopping here, and please, the last round of everybody who wants to make a point, now is the time.
Hi, I'm Madeline Schwartz. I'm the Milena Jazenka Fellow at the Institute currently. I wanted to make, I think, a small but important point, which is that the policies put in place by parties that make demographics a large part of their platform often don't work. And one very good example of this is Poland, where a number of policies have been put in place, including the total outlawing of abortion, and it has done absolutely nothing to increase the birth rate. And I think from my own journalism, talking to Polish women, and what's striking is that not only has the number of Polish women who seek abortions actually not gone down. Instead of doing it in Poland, they might come to Vienna, for example, or find other means. But the women who I've talked to who deal with these subjects often say that they're getting increasing numbers of calls from pregnant women who do not want to abort, but who are worried that the climate is so politicized that they don't actually know whether it's safe to be pregnant in their country. And I think that is very important when thinking about how, if we do think that demographic decline is a bad thing for democracies, how to put in place policies that make women feel safe and to become pregnant.
Thank you very much. Yeah, listen. Yeah, one more question.
One more. And that's the last one then.
Yeah.
But not the least. I'm a little bit abstract maybe before my question, because I have come from the country who now facing maybe in recent time, I believe, in short time, I believe we'll face definitely quite huge demographic crisis, but because and due to our struggling for our democracy. So I'm from Ukraine, and I think that speaking about topic about linkage between democracy and democracy, I think that the key point is, of course, the personality, the human being, every citizen of every country. And here maybe it's vice versa linkage, because democracy influences the level of demography situation in the country, and vice versa, as far as I said. So as a scientist and as a current deputy of local government, I would see that the linkage between the democracy and democracy now as simply saying it's politic. I mean, we may, as a politic women and men, we may propose any kind of reforms. We may do everything to make our society more powerful and more. We may solve any problems. For instance, if you say about the problem with the retiring people, so we have to promote both. We have to make some reforms to somehow protect younger women and push them actually and somehow proposed elaborate some reforms actually to strengthen and to help the young family to have more people for more children, and we may continue. So it's the reason of reforms and the reason of the goal and the aim of the governance. But at the first point and the main point here is that any state and every government should be controlled by the society. That in such a case we will have the equality of rights, and we will not have we will not face the problem of women in I don't know in any kind and any field of economy, because it's not the reason of education for women to be involved in the economic process. It's the point of equality. It's the point of the state of affairs in their human rights in the society.
Yes. Very much.
Let me make a demographic argument in the end, a prediction. There's going to be 8 billion people on our planet in June. World population is growing by about 80 million people a year. Why? Because there's many more births than deaths. This process will come to an end during the 21st century, or maybe at the beginning of the 22nd one. Why? Because with fewer and fewer young parents, the number of children born will go down anyhow, even if, so this is also not only dependent on the number of children per family, but also on how many young people you have that can potentially have children, number one. And number two, because of the many young people today, there's going to be many more people dying tomorrow. You can already see that. There's many more people dying in Germany than in Egypt, not because life is so much healthier in Egypt, but because Egypt has such a young population structure. So the interesting thing is population decline will be a general feature of the 22nd century. Latest in Africa, but in many places before that. And migration will make the difference more than anything else, making societies more diverse, more conflictual, whatever. So the interesting thing is that when we take a look at the demographically declining or stagnating and aging societies of today, it gives us a glimpse into the 22nd century as a general phenomenon. And there is no need, and then starts a worry. People are projecting, so we're going to disappear, we're going to decline. We have been 9 million, how can we survive with 7 million? All these things. Looking at Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, and a few other places, you can see size doesn't matter. You can be wealthy and surviving even with a small population base. Singapore is not having a high fertility rate. It's also something around 1. You just need to be attractive for others. And other places, there is no law on earth that says every square mile or square kilometer needs to be populated. For 99% of human history, it has not been the case. It was empty lands. And so we need to adapt to the vision that there might be empty lands in the future. The process that is painful, needs management, and to be taken care of is the transition. What do you do with the last generation of people, elderly citizens living somewhere where in the future nobody's going to be there? Once there's nobody, the public coffer will see relief because it's much cheaper to provide services in cities where people are concentrated than to provide them on the countryside per capita. Yeah? So concentrating people or having empty lands is no problem, unless you fight a war with your neighbor, because if Ukraine would be empty and nobody would be living there, there would be no defense. Yeah, there are certain cases where my argument doesn't count. But again, I'm saying Singapore, Switzerland, Hong Kong, a few other places, size doesn't matter. You can be small and rich, and you can be small and poor, and you can be large and poor, like many African countries. There is no direct relation between the one and the other. What we need to learn, and there is no theory for it, yeah? When you go to an economics library, you have tons of literature on growth theory. There is zero literature on shrinking theory and how to shrink in a decent way. Nobody wants, I mean, no, you cannot have an academic, could not have an academic career so far. Nobody would want to listen to you, no politician, no journalist, except for joking on you. But this is part of our future. We need to face it. We need to develop a whole thinking around the possibility that certain places on Earth will have fewer people tomorrow than they have today. And we are already in the midst of this process. And this is the whole, when you look at the world map, this is the northern part of the Eurasian hemisphere. It starts in Lisbon, or maybe on the Azores, and it goes via Berlin and Warsaw and Zagreb and Belgrade to Kiev and to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and ends in Vladivostok, and from there it goes to Tokyo and Yokohama and to Seoul and to Taipei on Taiwan. And that's a shrinking cosmos, and China will soon join that. That's a good deal of our planet. We just need to understand that this is a future. And I think, again, democracies will be more difficult to manage that than for authoritarian regimes. Yeah? So that's my so if you take a long view, you will see that what we are seeing and discussing here is something that will become a lot more urgent within our societies.
Thank you very much. On a positive note, there are going to be much more land, obviously, with such. Thank you very much.